Koutou katoa, my name is Hugh Campbell. Welcome everyone in the room, and hello to all the people who've joined online, which is a slightly dauntingly large number. So today's talk, once I get this in my hand, get the protocols correct, get that on the right part, and we no, it's a click. Got to. All right. Well, there was a very obvious whakatauki for today's talk. Kia whakatuamori te haere whakamua, the idea that we must walk backwards into the future. I believe James is probably the most beloved whakatauki of historians, and I will return to that particular whakatauki as we go through this talk for reasons that become obvious. I'll start with an apology. This was supposed to be a simple task. When Sonia and I were discussing, she sniffed out that I'd given a couple of keynotes at conferences last year, so we need one of those in our seminars. So I said, that'll be easy. I'll just grab the abstract of one of those. And then when I sat down to actually write this talk, I only got halfway through the abstract. So there's going to be a lot of backwards looking to get into the future, which we may have to get to in discussion time. So I'll rattle through my slides so we can get on to discussing how what I want to talk about here today reflects on how where we're moving to in terms of New Zealand farming. Now, someone online shout out if I lose content, or if you'd like me to turn the lights on so you can actually see me. Again, I was thinking that wasn't necessarily a wise idea. Stuart Hall is one of the great figures in modern social theory, and there's not going to be a huge amount of, as a sociologist, I'm not going to put too much social theory in this, conscious that the CSAFE seminars got a very diverse audience, and also once I start talking about social theory, I make a fool of myself. So, but Stuart Hall is one of the greats. He was the founder of what became known as the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, a radical new turn for critical thinking about British history and colonial history. And he's also uttered one of the great quotes that resonates through my field of studies, sort of the agriculture and food studies, or sort of a grand political economy of agriculture and food and how it shaped the world, and summarises, I'm the sugar at the bottom of the English cup of tea. He was asked a question at a meeting, who are you? What is your identity? Are you a Jamaican? Are you British? Are you English? Are you an academic? And he replied off the cuff, and this became the basis of an entire essay that he wrote later. I am the sugar at the bottom of the English cup of tea. I am the sweet tooth, the sugar plantations that rotted generations of English children's teeth. There are thousands of others beside me that are, the cup of tea itself. Because they don't grow it in Lancashire, Not a single tea plantation exists within the United Kingdom. This is the symbolisation of English identity. I mean, what does anyone in the world know about an English person, except that they can't get through the day without a cup of tea? Where does it come from? Ceylon, Sri Lanka, India? That is the outside history. That is inside the history of the English. There is no English history without that other history. Very, very famous quote that is sort of foundational to my area of study, and I thought a great way to start this talk off. Stuart Hall's, that particular quote then resonates through many studies of the relationship between slavery, Caribbean ethnicity, Britishness, capitalism, sugar. And I think it gets used in a lot of contexts that I come across. I mean, people use it to talk about the need to recognise the big structuring forces of global food systems. They use it to discuss the way in which I tend to go towards this one, which is the way in which a whole lot of really important things in life and important relationalities in history get invisibilised or rendered invisible to us. It's a quote that's used to discuss the invisible connection of classes, cultures, peoples, environments across time, and in difficult ways through the global production and consumption of food. It's an incredibly important quote for all countries and places that became involved in and were shaped by the great global food regime that emerged during the Industrial Revolution and brought the world together around a key set of food commodities. But I think the thing that I've always loved this quote, but the thing I really like about it, and particularly in terms of today's talk, is the way in which he positions I. at the start of that quote. It's I am the sugar. And so it's really been used by a lot of people who tend to think about big structural issues in the world as a positioning statement, as in a call to say, and think about where you are yourself. Think about your own history and this kind of thing. A little warm there, is it, Janet? Yes. And I wondered what would happen. I mean, to my best of my knowledge, Stuart Hall, he died in 2014, but I don't think he ever came to New Zealand. He would have been a very fun person to have come to New Zealand. But I think if Stuart Hall had ever visited our place, he would have, I think he would have immediately grasped the notion of whakapapa. And so I've been thinking in my recent writing and work about the way in which whakapapa is more than just a cultural concept. It's a kind of it's an entire ontology of the way in which we think about the world for ourselves as academics, and not only for ourselves, but in other things. And so I really think that, you know, this particular famous whakatauki about whakapapa is if you know who you are and where you're from, then you'll know where you're going. So I think that there's something to me from Stuart Hall that speaks to some of the journey that we're on in our place. I wonder again, I'm pretty sure Stuart Hall didn't visit Monterey Bay in California, but if he had, he would have come across Christine Sleater, who has surged into prominence recently. She's a very, very celebrated professor of education in the United States, but she's also extremely prolific. But she came up with this, she had this personal crisis that came from how you understand our histories. And she came up with this particular method for engaging, it started out as a method for teachers to use in classrooms. And then it morphed into a method that teachers used about themselves before they go into classrooms. And then a whole lot of academics picked it up and said, actually, this is really useful for us as well. And so Sleater's critical family history approach is kind of like, you need to know your whakapapa if you're going to teach and research in the world. So her critical family history approach, it comes from her own personal story. It came from the fact that she had a very celebrated matriarch in her family tree. This is I think her great-great-grandmother, who came to Minnesota from Norway, was the intellectual powerhouse of the whole clan, and drove and Sleater said in terms of the family's oral history, drove the quest for education in the family, education for all the girls that were growing up in different generations of the family. And she was kind of this towering figure that throughout her career, Christine Sleater had drawn on as this inspirational figure in her whakapapa. And then the triggering event is that with the move to the massive digitalization of online material, we don't need James Beattie anymore, because now we are all amateur historians. We can go online and research our own family history. And what we discover, as Christine Sleater discovered, is not all good. Because she discovered that in actual fact, her great-great matriarch, who'd been the inspiration of the family, was one of their leading intellectual drivers and publishers of white supremacism in Minnesota. And Sleater has this sort of oh crap moment as sort of this overwhelming new deluge of information about your past that your family have inhabited come up against cherished and carefully crafted oral tradition. And so she said, you know, so she came up with this method, critical family history, but how do you actually positively engage with that and learn both about yourself, your family, and history through a particular method of engagement, which says look into your family path, but look with open eyes as to the big relations and things that are shaping your past. Did I basically cover that? Yeah. So the early uses, this has been going for about 15 years now, pretty well tracking the rising prominence of Ancestry.com or MyHeritage.com or any one of the other massive, what should we call it, the genealogical industrial complex. Academics have jumped into this area and they're talking about, well, there's been stuff written about critical family history, about democratizing knowledge of history. It's not just prominent people in the accounts that get the critical family history. It has actually the way in which we bring out more poor people's history, giving people whose histories are being erased a chance to represent their past again. My friend Carolyn Morris at Massey, when I was first looking into my own family background, basically said, and looking at all the stuff online, she said, why are you going there? She said, I said, well, it's interesting. She goes, well, it's okay for you. She says, but I just worry about all these people doing their genealogy in New Zealand, is that for Pākehā New Zealanders, you're basically going to be about 2 generations away from tales of colonial bastardry. And she comes back in the story. It's about making your own personal history reflexive and relational. If I was going to be in a methods class, I'd say, enacting an ontology of whakapapa to structure the way we look at the world, ourself, the past, the rationalities, as a structuring framework for inquiry. And it's a chance to rethink the future by rethinking the past. So, for me, the interesting question is, has critical family history's approach been applied to food or farming stuff, the stuff that I do, other than implicitly Stuart Hall was doing critical family history? Sleater, in one of her thousands of publications, wrote this. She's very into pedagogical interventions and actions, and so she wrote this sort of young adults, what they call social fiction series that are to be used in classrooms. And she wrote this novel for teenagers that she called White Bread, about how Latino school kids needed to sort of, many, many things about the experience of Latino school kids in America, but how they needed the space to bring their culinary histories to school, plus a whole lot of other things. For me, I first found out about critical family history after I'd written my book that got published in 22, when Avril Bell saw my book and said, oh, you're doing critical family history. I went, oh, am I? How interesting. Anyway, Avril recently retired from sociology, but she pulled a group of people together and guest edited a special issue of the journal Genealogy on what she calls critical settler family histories, and invited pieces from those of us in New Zealand and a number in Australia who had started writing about our own families as a portal into understanding colonisation, which there's a lot of people doing that. But Avril got an interesting group together. And when you look at that, Genealogy is a journal that was set up specifically to say the world of genealogy has gone completely mad and interesting and productive in a whole lot of unexpected ways with the online digitalisation of information about people's family pasts. We want a journal to academically engage with this and engage with the kinds of things we do. So Avril's special issue was Christine Sleater wrote the introduction to it. And surprisingly or not, when you look at Australian and New Zealand critical family histories, particularly by Pākehā scholars, there's a lot of farms lurking in there. There are farms. So that's a piece, I'll get back to that piece that I wrote with my cousin, William Kleinana-Cuthers, who may be online. He's very, very busy today, but he was going to see if he could check in from the Waikato. This is Carolyn, got drawn into it, the tales of colonial bastardy indeed. Now you're going to write about your own family farm in Rohutu in Taranaki. This is Avril Bell herself. I'll get through to these. Richard Shaw was one of the contributors, but his article was based on his book, The Forgotten Coast, about his own family history in Taranaki. And I was drawn into it through this, where I used looking at my own family's farms as a way of trying to create a portal into understanding changes in New Zealand during colonisation. So just quickly running through where we're standing with these people before I jump back to myself. Avril is descended from the Graham family, which is a very prominent family in Auckland and Northland. The Grahams had arrived early into the Auckland settlement and obtained land, interestingly, in the same ballot that my family grabbed some land. And then both parties sold the farmland in Auckland to the great regret of subsequent generations, because we'd now be billionaires with 21 acres in Remuera. My lot, the story will soon get told, but her lot stuck it somewhere else and then bought farmland after the wars in Northland. She describes exactly how they got it, and it's not great. I'm not familiar with Northland history to know exactly what kind of land was being alienated or confiscated, but as Avril said, it's not good. And they got that land, and then she set herself the task of saying, what wealth came from that land? How does that wealth accumulate in the next generation? What proportion of the wealth of the next generation? And she was sort of saying, it was using it as a device to say, as descendants from Pākehā farms, how much of our capital now, how much of our wealth, how much of what makes us affluent middle-class people now comes from these disputed moments of capture. which is really quite an interesting task. She said, I'm not an economist. I think there's a better way of doing this. The rough answer, I can't give you a number, but the rough answer is quite a bit. Carolyn Morris and Richard Shaw, our Taranaki faction. Richard wrote this book investigating the discovery that his grandfather, Andrew Gilhooly, had been in the armed constabulary, that had been in the first group into Parihaka, conducting the atrocities there, and that his family had never, this is sort of had been a massive moment of historical amnesia in his own family history. So he wrote The Forgotten Coast about Parihaka and then the generations subsequently. Lovely book, very, very, very accessible, which sparked such a backlash of anger from some people that he then has just released a second book about the backlash to the first book. It's called The Unsettled, which, because this particular field is very intermeshed, the cover design is a stitchwork blanket of Taranaki Maunga by Carolyn Morris. Carolyn Morris herself, in Not Talking, Not Knowing, described autoethnographically her own childhood on a farm growing up out of Rahotu in Taranaki. And she describes, how sort of the day-to-day politics of farming, the cultural politics of living and growing up on a farm is for her, she's the same age as me, so we grew up in these worlds in the late 60s and early 70s. It's the politics of forgetting and historical amnesia. I think there was some Janet who possibly grew up on farms that didn't have a politics of forgetting and historical amnesia, but they were not typical farms. And what did they learn? And as Carolyn argues, really, what they learned is that historically for Pākehā farms to thrive, you have to put a lot of cultural work and a lot of effort into not talking, not knowing about the past of the land. As she said, it was remarkable later becoming an anthropologist, looking back and going, it's like I had this confrontation with the first time as an undergraduate student you get placed inside a Maori studies course at Massey University. She said, and you're feeling as a Pākehā kid, you sort of, okay, I'm encountering Maoriness for the first time. She said, and then after a while as an anthropology postgrad going, actually, but that's actually not true, because on our farm alone and on my uncle's farm right next door, were a series of urupa that local hapa used to come to regularly, and there was this kind of this with her dad and their uncle, there was just kind of some kind of communication and a nod and a wink, and Maori went and did their Maori thing on their farm, but this had nothing to do with their farm. It was kind of the strange anomaly that everyone looked away from. It's a really lovely article, and I think very, very poignant. So if we started off with this whakatauki, the message from the special issue of Genealogy on critical settler family histories is we need to correct it. So reflecting how Pākehā farm families think about histories and future is that we must only walk forwards and pay no attention at all to the past. Yes. Well, if you're online, that's you, if you can see yourself on the screen. Looking magnificent, by the way. So my contribution to this was a collaboration with my fourth cousin, once removed, William Kainana Covers, and we found each other while I was researching my book and discovered that he had been researching his whakapapa at one line and got to this mysterious woman who was married to some guy in the Upper Waipa in the 1850s and 1860s. I was researching my Pākehā whakapapa up to this guy who mysteriously in his will mentions this Maori woman. And so we found each other, and I think Willie had worked, he's a smarter and more perceptive person than me, so he'd worked out more about Dennett Heather. We knew nothing. This is our longest family, the Heather family in New Zealand. We knew nothing, did not know who Unaiki Te Watarohi was. We didn't even know her name was Te Watarohi. But she was the second wife of Dennett Heather. His first wife, Mary Ann White, who I'm descended from, drowned, as you did in colonial times, with two of her three children, and I'm descended from the one who survived in the lifeboat. And Dennett went and travelled up the Waipa to set up a trading post, and then met, or maybe had already met Unaiki and married, and they got this farm, 170 acres, that locally the piece of land was known as Maratahe, but on the maps was described as Heather's homestead. It was 170 acres, It was potatoes, watermelons, peaches, apples, cattle, and it was like one of those portals out of the breadbasket of the Waikato that was at that stage in the 1850s and 60s feeding Auckland. And this was one of these few little hinge farms where there was a Maori Pākehā collaboration very successfully happened. It spectacularly goes wrong in 1864 with in the second phase of the invasion of the Waikato, because Heather's homestead and the trading post is the farthest upstream the barges can travel with General Cameron's troops. And so the troops march from Aotearoa up the Waipa on the bank, and then the barges go as far as they can, which is the trading post, and offload. And so this huge encampment is set up on our farm. The houses, the people flee, the houses, Nike flees across the river to her people with Ngāti Tamanupo. Dennett takes the children up to Otahu. They never meet again. And the farm's looted, potatoes are torn in, the trees are cut down. And it's from this encampment, General Cameron and his dudes sit there for a couple of weeks looking at this massive line of fortified pa, and then they work out how to sneak around it, and the Rangiawhia massacre happens. They literally decamp from the farm, sneak around. And so it has this sort of infamous piece of footprint of land, has this infamous moment in history. And so Willie and I wrote about this farm and this moment in history, the raupatu that separated Maori and Pākehā worlds. And it was a really, really interesting collaboration that, for a Pākehā descendant and a Maori descendant from the same farm, how you view and see and understand that same piece of land. It was great. I really enjoyed it. It's just a pity he and I are so busy we haven't been able to do another piece together. This is a survey of the farm in 1845 of the land. Present at the survey, Mr. Heather and his natives. This is a map drawn by one of the officers in General Cameron's group. Basically, use this so people online can see, but this is coming from the north, from here, from Auckland up. This is the Waipa River, this is the Waikato River, and you come up the Waipa River as far as is navigable. So of course, this is Ngarawahia there. And you come as far as you can, Lake Naroto outside Te Awamutu. You can see these.
Your pointer is on the wrong screen.
Oh, no. All right. Waipa, Waikato. I'm hoping it's on the right screen here. The action takes place here, and if you expand it, you can't see it particularly well, but here's the roadway, the path up the ridgeline that the troops follow. Mr. Heathers sits here. This is the farm sitting here. And then there was the great swamp, great wetland around Lake Naroto. Interesting. What did I learn from this piece of critical family history? I learned with Willie that I have somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 Maori, Samoan, and Maori, Kuka, and Samoan cousins who have a name. They're descended from Stanley Heather, the half-brother of Arthur Heather, who I'm descended from, Dennett's son with Unaiki, and they have a name, Ngāti Taneri, and they've been getting together and know themselves as a group for a very long time. It's interesting. That before 1863 and the invasion of the Waikatos is, of course, one of the most debated and teased over moments in New Zealand history, the reasons for the invasion of the Waikato and its huge consequences. But what the politics of the moment, I think, what was obscuring for me, I knew the history, well, I had read accounts of the history of the Kingitanga, the crisis of sovereignty. I'd read James Bellich's accounts. I knew that this was the big moment when a whole lot of collaborative things that might have happened get fractured and split up. But it was actually contemplating that farm that you get the extent to which really a substantial thing was being made between Maori and Pākehā in that part of the world before the invasion. And that the raupatu, separating Maori and Pākehā worlds, as we wrote about in our article together for Willie and I, that's a separation that takes place in 1864 that comes back together in 2020. So that's sort of quite a separation of peoples who don't really know of each other's existence. And my Pākehā cousins, who were the family genealogists, were pretty scuzzy on this. Their characterisation of who was this Unaiki that is named in Dennet Percy Heather's will. And their characterisation of her was uncomplimentary. Yeah. Number 2 farm, Dunedin, out of Dunedin. So this is the first of the Campbell line of farms. So if the Heather farm in the Waikato talks about the politics, sheer political power of colonisation and separation, the bringing together and then the fracturing and sundering of Maori and Pākehā worlds, this one tells a slightly different, well, there's certainly elements of it because it's colonial New Zealand. So James and Isabella Campbell married in Dunedin, met and married in Dunedin. They had neighbouring farms up at Halfway Bush. And they arrive in 1882 into Taranaki after having farmed the original family farm that they bought, called Ashburn Estate, up on the hillside over there, that when they left in 1882 was sold to a group of investors and turned into a psych hospital. So they arrive at Glen Road. Well, James's older brother, Archie, has been getting spectacularly rich engaging in speculation and land titles in Taranaki, and is basically one of the people perched on the fence rail as Parihaka is being looted and sacked, and begins just acquiring, using the capital he's already got to acquire. At one stage, his name is on 40 land titles in the confiscated lands of in Taranaki and the Waimea Plains, so down right through South Taranaki. Archie sells one of these blocks to his brother James, and they set up this farm on the Waimea Plains on the stolen land. And the story of this farm is, it's a lot about, I mean, if you go by the newspaper account, it's a lot about stock breeding. James Jamison Campbell turned into a really expert stock breeder and is celebrated in agricultural shows for the next 30 years. But for me, when I was writing about this farm, I was writing about ecological consequences. This is a very well-known picture of the decline in forest cover between 1840 and 2000. This is an equally perhaps less well-known, but this, of course, is the extent and the loss of wetlands. So as I wrote about in my book, the collapse, the pushing back of the forest frontier and the wetland frontier. I won't use my clicker, but this is the original farm is here. The big blue spot there is where the subsequent generation of farms are going to eat into the Nairi wetland just outside Eltham. We have two photographs of the original farm in Glen Road, which my wife Marion rendered into pen and ink for me to make them a little more, they're a little blitzed by time, but this is the Glen Road farm in 1880s. Judging by this is James and Isabella and their children, and you can see a lot of characteristic stuff going on there. They've got, it's the characteristic lumpy pasture of stuff that's been burned out of bush, with the grass growing over and incorporating the stuff. The understory of everything's just been sucked in. There's not that many fencing battens there. Beautiful house with a prayer tower on top overlooking the ocean. They were devout brethren. And that's why they left Dunedin. And there's a little sawmill here, and there's this pile of palings, planks and that have been stacked up to dry in the sun, and there's the forest frontier right behind the main house. And then judging by the age of the children, you come back in the 1890s, they're now teenagers lounging around the place, and you're starting to see the grass is doing its work, the sward has become much smoother, the remains of the forest, although according to oral history in the family, the subsequent generations were doing ploughing charcoal up for some decades after this from the bush burning. There's a lot of battens, plump haystacks, and there's no bush. That's James, and that's the next Archie, not the land plunderer Archie, and the next one, which is the Eltham house that sits on a little knoll out in the Nairi wetlands, and away they go digging ditches out, exposing dairy country. So the first farm at Glen Road began 5 more farms in that area, all of which were ecologically attained through frontier pushing back frontiers of forest and wetland to create pasture. James Jamieson Campbell ends up in the Taranaki papers a lot because he comes down to Dunedin to a celebrated bloodstock importer, a farm in Dunedin, McMeeking, I think, who are importing Aberdeen Angus of the Erica line of Aberdeen Angus cattle. He gets 2, Hatter and Gladys, who breed for him. Prize winners in Taranaki: cupbearer, Adonis, Cavalier, Captain, Colonel, Cronje, Black Don, Darky, DeWitt, Barber, and on it goes. And that's Hatter. I like electrician, which, you know, in the first decade of the 20th century would have been an advanced occupation of modernity. And what do we learn from this one? Well, first, it's the fate of confiscated lands after Parihaka, but it's the way in which farms expanded land area and became profitable by cutting down bush and draining wetlands. It's about, increasingly as the 20th century gathers pace, about the role of science and the science of stock breeding in making farmers profitable. And it shows really the Campbells and the Langs, where Isabella comes from, people whose small business collapsed during the Industrial Revolution in Scotland, and so came to Dunedin as free churches, and her family were crofters, turned off their crop in the Highland clearances. So they arrived into Dunedin without a lot. The obituary for James Jamieson Campbell, sadly not for Isabella so much, is of this incredibly respectable, prosperous and leading farmer in Taranaki. Farm number 3, your protagonist is on screen. Love those pants. I remember my mother giving me those pants. So that's 4-year-old Hugh with his older brother Douglas on the tree stump at Longridge. He's now the professor of New Testament at Duke University. That's why, is he holding a book? Is that a book he's holding to his chest? That would say everything about our relative lives growing up. All right, Longridge. Longridge came into the family in 1946 after my mother's father, Tom Aitchison. Tom and Dorothy took over Longridge, purchased not as a soldier settlement block, but using a return serviceman's loan to purchase a farm. It was rough, newly cleared hill scrub country in South Hawke's Bay, Whangaho. And my grandfather had no farming background. They came from pretty scuzzy generations. This is not the respect. Amongst the many slightly less respectable lines of my family, this one's scraped up from the bottom. But he was an intelligent man. He was a deeply troubled man as well, but he was highly intelligent, and he learned the technical science of farming from scratch, learning it at the pub and from booklets and brochures. And eventually putting sheep onto that land and scrub cutting away, eventually he leaves that farm and comes to our farm in the Waikato, leaving behind a Perrindale stud, the New Zealand's first Perrindale sheep stud. But the animals that really made that farm were the horses. And they went from very lowly to highly respectable. He became the president of the New Zealand Pony Clubs Association. My grandparents were the 2 people who were commissioned by Princess Anne to establish an organisation in New Zealand in 1973 called Writing for the Disabled. And so they went around, they travelled the country, setting up the first chapters of Writing for the Disabled in New Zealand, and became these kind of... They made this journey from highly unrespectable, which I had no idea about that history, because of course I grew up and everything's going extremely well, and we've become kind of leading figures in the community. And I do feel hugely conflicted. I mean, I knew these 2 people very, very well, and as I delve deeper into history and find worse and worse things out, you do feel like, you know, this carefully cultivated thing that I grew up with, you do wonder in the extent of my rights to disturb that narrative. Anyway, I've been talking with my siblings and my cousins about that. They say, go for it. We like the good, we like the bad with the good. Anyway, they created the conditions in which I was raised, because they came north of the Waikato and became the managers of our farm that I was raised on, a world without a difficult past, but we knew we were the good people of New Zealand, the Pākehā livestock farmers of New Zealand. There we are again, there's the horses. In the wider family, I was the graft on the great venture of equestrianism that failed to take. I hated riding horses, and that did cause some issues. So, you know, I was the one in the bedroom with no walls full of ribbons that my brother and sister had. Final farm, number 4. We're making progress. We are making progress. So this is a view of Windsor Lodge. Remember, this is my grandparents' house. This is the cottage we converted up here that we lived in the weekends. This is a sort of a soaky, sluggish part of in the State Highway, what used to be State Highway 1 from Aotearoa through Taupiri, used to run right through here. So for my grandfather, this was a real eyesore, this swampy thing. It kept on trying to get grass to grow, and there were a couple of manky little trees in it, and it ran down through the paddock, causing badness on his beautiful grass pastures that could be seen by other farmers from the road. We'll get back to that. Windsor Lodge, Horsey family.
Windsor.
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 They named it. I wrote about this in my book. It's like, ooh, Windsor Lodge. Interesting. I think as I described it in the book, it's like interesting thing growing up on a farm which had the most borrowed of English names and planted into a new land. When the House of Windsor itself was borrowed as an English name to place on a group of top of German aristocrats that became the British royal family. All right, so that farm was owned by our family trust. It was basically a tax soak for my father, who was a doctor. Both my parents grew up on farms, but my grandparents ran it. But it was a loss-making venture in the early 70s to avoid paying tax. It had been a horse stud. We were running beef, and then finally my grandfather specialised. The thing that he liked in his retirement was leasing dairy calves, leased grazing of dairy calves from the local dairy factory, stud dairy calves. And so we literally had, you know, the cutest farm in history as you would drive around as little Massey Ferguson with this gambling little herd of calves bounding along behind him ridiculously. As I reflected back on it in the 2020 book, it was a landscape characterised by suspiciously flat, fertile paddocks out the back. So if you go back to here, this is the fertile area of the farm, is this stuff here. And it's got that magnificently flat Waikato feel. You know, we're on a little bunch of little hills here. You look this way from the farmhouse, from the hillside here, you look straight to Taupiri Mountain, about 5 k's away. But this, of course, for those who know their landscape history, those classically flat, fertile paddocks are drained wetlands. Although in that part of the Waikato, it would have almost certainly have been kaikatea forest growing wet out of the land. It's a landscape, yes. So until I began researching my book, I didn't know the name of the iwi that used to be associated with that wetland for resource gathering. I found out it was Ngāti Hawa. And that I write in the book about the battle that took place over the little soaky, swampy bit on the front paddock that people could see from the road, because my grandparents managed the farm, but actually my mother also felt that she managed the farm as well. My father wanted nothing to do with it. And my mother and my grandfather got into this big battle about what to do with the wetland. And my mother won, and so that swampy bit got planted out in 1984. We found a photograph of my mother's proud photograph about the wetland. When I was growing up on the farm, there was a very clear kind of moral structure to the farm. We were the good people. We were good people because we knew who bad people were. We had a very clear sense of who the bad people were. The bad people were the unionists at the meatworks stealing our money off us, Labour governments in general because they facilitated the Labour unions. And then later there was, as I recounted in the book, there's this rising tension between a group of liberal university-educated grandchildren coming back to the farm and discussing this new Treaty of Waitangi resurgence happening around the place, which alarmed my grandparents greatly. There was one particularly heated dinner argument about it, sort of around a Christmas dinner or something like that, in which my grandmother finally simply stood up and declared, "Who won the land wars?" And that was the world we grew up in. It was like the hidden history was the history of conquest. and the history of massive environmental change. So there was the wetland, and then when I was writing the book, I sent my old best friend from Hamilton with a camera and said, "Can you go and see if there's anything left in that front paddock?" And he drove up the road off the main road, and there it was. Slightly different angle, but of course, wet terrain in the Waikato grows trees. And so all that stuff had just burst back into life, although he's got it from the end on, so you can't see it trailing down towards the main road with the Aotearoa range in the background. Well, I can't really summarise in one slide what I learned from that farm, but I wrote about it as two realities. There's a difference between farming inside invisible worlds and farming inside actual histories. And I think if I just focus on the wetland battle that happened and the fact that the farm, when we sold it, it was bought by the neighbouring dairy farm, of course, incorporated, and I wrote in my book about looking at the aerial photographs now, the Google map stuff of, the simplification. But that wetland survived. So my mother's little battle held one little patch that got pulled back out of the grasslands frontier, pushed back the grasslands frontier, but it was a very small game in the face of the wider intensification of systems around it in the Waikato. And so, the political character of this history of erasure. This is the most quoted line out of Farming Inside Invisible World, which had magically rendered invisible prior owners, indigenous claims, indigenous ecologies, was reproduced in our daily lives and actions. We were effectively farming inside invisible worlds, or looked at it a little less charitably, we were able to farm peacefully and successfully precisely because other worlds had become invisible. So if I reflect back now on a Christine Sleater-esque sense of both of my own farms and the farms we wrote about in the special issue of Genealogy and Richard Shaw's great investigations, I mean, a critical settler family history of New Zealand for Pākehā scholars is really coming up with some key thematics. A lot more than this, but time is ticking. Really the farms are the key agent of colonisation in New Zealand, both in terms of being a site of initial collaboration and alliance between Maori and Pākehā worlds, but then being the place where the great fracture happens, that then rolls on for generations. That farms erased alternative land uses, they reshaped landscapes, they locked in an entirely new and unstable ecological pattern in New Zealand. That for all the scholars working in this area, Pākehā scholars, what Simon, are you online? Describes as the Pākehā Guild Club. That wealth and respectability through generations increased farm by farm for the settled descendants of these farms. Certainly in my family it did. And as Avril Bell accounted for herself. And that farms became, as Carolyn Morris wrote, this key site of historical amnesia or cultural forgetting. So farms shaped the cultural and politics of identity in Aotearoa New Zealand. And so I live permanently now in two worlds, the farming world I grew up on, which was always a place that I knew and loved, and it was a landscape that I loved. With this, in the Christine Sleater sense, I was like trying to reconcile this with the other history of those farms and that landscape, seen in that Christine Sleater sense. So the question for me is, like, if you ask me the question, I asked myself the question for this talk, the Stuart Hall, who am I question that he answered, I am the sugar in your English cup of tea. Here's where I've got to. Who am I? I am the high-yielding Perindale sheep, surrounded by mismothered lambs running across a hilly paddock in New Zealand. I am the fences that sliced up a land once collectively owned by Maori. I am the grass pasture that covers over the burned forests and drained wetlands. I am the settler farmer celebrating 5 generations of ownership of land that once was loved by 55 generations of another people. I am the workers in abattoirs, the muslin-bagged carcasses of frozen sheep in the cargo hold of the SS Dunedin bound for London. I am the government of a colonised land living under the rule of the farmers, by the farmers and for the farmers. This is the symbolisation of identity in Aotearoa New Zealand. But we didn't eat all that meat or bake all that butter into scones and pie crust. Nearly all of it went to somewhere else, to Britain, to the country that colonised us, placed my family in the landscape, erased environments, erased other futures and possibilities, and taught us the virtue of producing meat, butter and wool. That is the outside history that is inside the history of the British in Aotearoa New Zealand. There is no British history of food without that other history of colonial farms. Thank you. What are we now? We'll go back to our whakatauki. I think we can restore our whakatauki back to its original form. Question time. Do you have access to, do you want to jump online and see if anyone wants to just, we'll do the stop share and then ask if anyone wants to ask questions.
Can I just mention that we need to stop probably about there's 3 minutes to 12 to see.
To reset the room for our much more exciting and less introspective adventure. Mechanic.
If that's who you are, which you be.
Yeah, so that's the second half of the talk that I didn't get to sit down and write. But it's so to put it in a slightly more specific context. What this is some part of the venture that Tom Brooking and I are undertaking, writing our new book, in which Sam Earlworthy at Auckland University Press has asked us to write a sort of a history of New Zealand farming from the perspective of people's actual family farms. And these are my ones. Tom has his own ones that he's writing little vignettes about. And we're picking a sort of a selection of others to tell the story of the trajectory of farming by colonisation, the gold, sort of the peak farm power in the 1950s and 60s, and then the various crises that begin to beset farming through the 70s and 80s and into now. And what we're writing that book as is, we're describing it as the sort of the 200-year history of farming from 1840 to 2040. Because the last 15 years of the book, we want to select farms that we think are sitting in the portals that are shaping the future of landscape use. So first thing to say is that in terms of the farms that I would look at professionally to say, who are we becoming as land users? Sorry, missed one important point out. Ethel Anderson, the great archaeologist of Ngāi Tahu, I remember being taught by him in 1983, and he described the way in which, the prehistory of New Zealand tells the story of initial arrival and then about 200 years of resource exploitation, extinction and chaos until the resource system for Maori and New Zealand collapses, the voyaging back and forth with the Pacific stops, and Maori are confronted with how do we become sustainable in this new land, and how do we learn to love this new land? So Ethel's argument was, there's a kind of a 200-year position where you go from being colonial exploiters of a new landscape to people who are learning to love and settle and work there, and then Maori have many centuries to sort of stabilise that pattern before we arrive. And I was discussing, there was Anaru Ekatone, who's one of my senior colleagues over in the other part of the university, and he was saying, so are your Pākehā farmers, are they on a 200-year challenge? And I thought, yeah, that's an incredibly useful thing to think with, in the sense of what is the 200-year challenge being played out in New Zealand farms, and where will we land in the bicentenary of the treaty in terms of what our farms look like? Because they certainly won't look like what they looked like in the 50s, 60s and 70s. They won't look like what is currently happening on the Canterbury Plains in terms of intensive dairying. They will look like something else if it's going to be happening. And so we've been thinking about what do those farms look like? First, the exemplars of land use that are some of the most compelling exemplars are the newly resurgent Maori land trusts and incorporations. Some of those things are just phenomenal things going on in those spaces in terms of a different way to think about landscape, a more integrated way to think about landscape, diverse production, but also prioritising benefits to people, the way in which community or people prosper around good systems of land use rather than simply what your profit bottom line is. But in terms of for Pākehā livestock farmers who are in such a state of crisis and uncertainty and anxiety at the moment, when I'm talking in a rural hall to that group at the moment. I sort of say the challenge we're facing as the descendants of the golden age of livestock farming is that we have to think about a landscape that has less animals and more trees. Because ecologically, that's where New Zealand is taking us back to. The animals are a temporary phase, and they will remain there, but they won't remain there in the footprint that's there now. And so we have trees. We already have trees coming back, but the trees are a really big cultural thing for Pākehā livestock farmers to confront. Some are fine. Sure, Janet grew up on a farm in the South Waikato with gazillions of trees being planted on the farm, but around her, everyone else was chopping them down. And we're still having this fight about SNAs, and we need the right on our private property to keep cutting that bush down. And for God's sake. So there's that. The second thing is that we have to think what land use looks like when you break the tightly bounded private property straitjacket that's on New Zealand farming system. So a lot of farming in countries around the world, there's a lot more collaboration across the farm boundary. They have softer farm boundaries. People feel a greater sense of right of access. There's, you know, when I work in Scandinavia, there's the right to roam, which is very strongly culturally respected. There's a much higher proportion of farmers are selling directly to local community, and they employ people directly from local communities. So we've developed, I mean, we've locked ourselves into very hard boundaries in Pākehā livestock farming in New Zealand. So I think that's another thing that I'm thinking about how we change. And the social, ecological, political. So I think the political challenge is we are not heading in a good direction politically in terms of farming in New Zealand at the moment. That the reaction to a long erosion of the primary place of farmers in New Zealand politics is at the moment sort of this very reactionary backlash, and it's doing damage. So I think I'm trying to think about how, well, there's a number of people trying to think about how to rethink the politics of being farmers and being rural in New Zealand over the next 30 years. Sorry, very long answer. I love the question. Me personally, I'm going to retire. Trying to wrestle with whether we keep our piece of land up in the Waitaki Valley.
You mentioned 200 years, Hugh. I'm just wondering whether, 2040, 200 years after the signing of the treaty, to what extent that highly significant time can be used in terms of helping shape a sustainable future.
Yes, I think you're, so for those online, Kath's question was like, given we have their bicentenary coming up, the time between here and there is not that long. And I think you're right. I think it's a moment, it's a bit like the millennium when everyone was sort of thinking as a millennium, and then we got captured by the Y2K bug crisis, not crisis. I think it is the centenary generated exactly that kind of thing. There was a war going on at the time, but the New Zealand government commissioned a whole lot of academic and reflective pieces, didn't they, James? You know, and people like Sir Kenneth Cumberland, who was the first kind of great geographer in New Zealand, wrote a really influential piece on New Zealand farming, reflecting on the fact that, you know, the tone of the moment is that we are amazingly successful and popular, and we're doing incredible things scientifically. And he, you know, his basic argument was, no, actually, this is a really fragile, rapidly elaborating experiment, which is taking us to places we don't yet know, simply in terms of the landscape ecology of New Zealand in the 1940s, when they were still massively struggling with soil erosion. Something we don't worry about now. Do we have any soil erosion problems, flooding events? Yeah, I guess it's okay if you can blame it all on forestry slash and not worry about the 85% of the Eskdale silt that came off pasture.
I just have to list what James said.
James, you make it a comment rather than question.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Gary. Just a sort of question looking ahead. So New Zealand's still basically one giant farm. So what role will overseas markets play in the role and the emphasis on, say, sustainability of carbon footprint and miles have on New Zealand's farms here? Will that not be a powerful driver as it has been in the past?
Mhm.
So does that give you cause for hope?
Yes, it will. So the question for people online was how much will New Zealand still is hugely reliant on international markets. At the moment, in terms of progressive movement on climate change mitigation and farming and greenhouse gas accounting, given the current government has essentially abandoned that and it walked away from 20 years, over a decade of negotiation between groups as to what that would look like. The key driver, ironically, the key driver of whatever change happens next in New Zealand in dairy farming around climate change will be Nestle. On that positive note, I believe I'm going to hand over the room to the next group of users, but thank you very much for coming along.
It was 17.
Everything online. Honey,
Last word you just mentioned,
Nestle.
Nestle.
Yeah, because they're the ones putting demands on